Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we've taken a few more minutes to get ready. If you can confirm that you hear us by putting into the Q&A chat where you are coming from, what state you're in. And we'll get started in just a moment. All right, looks like we have people from all over the country, so this is great, including a few names that we're starting to recognize from our weekly webinar. So if you're back to them, thank you for coming back, and we'll get started here in just a moment. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We hope you're doing well today. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. We'll be running a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A in your Zoom control panel like you just did. And if you miss anything, don't worry, we'll be sending around the recording when it's available. We'll also be presenting poll questions. So if you have your mobile phone ready to text in answers, or there's a web option as well. My name is Allie Nickel, and I'm the Product Innovation Manager at the CE Shop, the leading provider of online real estate education. Today, we are reviewing property ownership as it relates to your licensing exam, presented by Lucy Michaud. Lucy comes to us with many years of experience within the real estate industry. She has focused on transactional law for both real estate and business organizations and is a certified distance education instructor with Arello. Now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Lucy.
Thank you, Allie, for the introduction. It's great to be speaking with all of you today. I'm going to briefly go over the agenda. You heard a little bit about me. I'm a professor at the University of Connecticut. I teach real estate law and real estate principles. We're going to do a brief poll and then talk about property ownership, spend some time on Q&A, and then cover some additional materials before we conclude. So let's get into the poll. Okay, so if you could go ahead and enter where you are as far as the progress that you've made. 100%, wow. Is that possible? Oh, 50-50. I'll just give it a little while longer to make sure everyone has time to get in. Okay, so we're changing it up a little bit. Some of you are right at the beginning and it looks like the rest are almost finished. Okay, that's pretty interesting. So we have a pretty wide range of students and it looks like everyone's in, I think. Great. Okay, so we'll talk about the topics first that are going to be covered on the test. You'll see that the pie chart divides all the different areas into the percentage of questions that are on the exam. We're going to be talking today about property ownership, which covers about 8%. So let's go on and get started with that topic. Okay, property ownership has to do with real versus personal property and how that property is conveyed. We'll be talking about the characteristics of land and legal descriptions. There are different types called meets and bounds, government survey system, how those lots and pieces of land are measured, and also talking about mineral, air, and water rights. When we get into encumbrances and how they affect property ownership, we'll look at different types of liens and also easements and licenses, encroachments, and then other types of encumbrances such as mortgages and other liens that encumber the property. Types of ownership include tenants in common, joint tenancy. Those two types are most common, in most states. Tenants in common is when more than two people, it could be two or more, have ownership of property. Joint tenancy is typically married couples, And also, we're going to be getting into common interest ownership, referred to as timeshares, the difference between condos and co-ops, and then talking about ownership and severalty. And we can move on. Here's the difference between real property and real estate. Real property is defined as land and everything that's attached to the land. That would include buildings, any type of structures, maybe a shed, a garage. And the real estate refers to the legal rights that come with ownership of land. We'll be getting into those in more detail, and also talking more about the mineral rights, air rights, and other bundles of rights that come with property on the next slide. Okay, so this bundle of rights that I referred to is the way that land is owned and everything that comes along with it. So you have the right to minerals, if we could just go back and look at that previous one. And that could include oil, gas, any kind of precious metals, maybe gold. Air rights include the right to use and develop property. Typically that's for a building. And you can go as high into the air as you can use. So you could build a skyscraper in Manhattan or just a regular residential home in the suburbs. Air rights are anything that you can use above your land. Water rights have to do with navigable bodies of water, and navigable means that it's used for commerce. Riparian rights have to do with the reasonable use of water, and that's from rivers or streams. So if you have the right to use water, it would be for maybe watering your crops or maybe for other purposes connected to the land. Prior appropriation means that the first person to use the water from a stream has the beneficial use to do that and can acquire those rights, just based on any reasonable use. If someone maybe further down the stream doesn't get to use as much water as they would like, that's okay, as long as it's for beneficial, reasonable use. And that's the theory of prior appropriation. Littoral has to do with water that is an ocean, a sea, or a lake. So if you have littoral rights and you have some land on the shore, you can build a dock, or you can use the water for any other recreational purposes, boating, water skiing, fishing, swimming, any type of use that you would like. There are sometimes accretions and relictions, and that has to do with natural causes such as a hurricane that would either add soil to the land, or maybe the water is receding and that's resulting in a larger portion of land. So now you have maybe a larger section of beach near the ocean, which could be a very good thing. And if you have any body of water within your land that's contained within the boundaries, of course you have the exclusive right to use that. And sometimes, landowners with large parcels, maybe 15, 20 acres, may have a pond or a lake contained within their land. Okay, talking about the bundle of rights. These rights that you receive come with the land, and it refers to legal privileges, a set of rights that includes the right to use real estate, to sell it, you could lease it. Of course, to control it just means that you have the right to control the use of the property, to exclude others, can be excluded from your property. And those rights come with the land for any owner, and it gives them this set of legal privileges. Okay, we can move along. And here's our first question. So as far as the definition of land, if you could enter your response, A, B, C, or D, as to the best definition. I'll give you a little bit more time to think about this one. Is it, okay, so some of you are going with answer C. Any other takers? Okay, that might be everyone that's responded. Maybe give it a few more seconds. Someone changed their mind. Okay, we finally have someone that chose answer D. All right, so split evenly with the last three. Okay, I guess that'll do it. I'm gonna spend a little bit more time talking about the definition of land. It is D. Land can be subdivided, and the surface of the land, I think that first answer that most of you chose is maybe a little bit confusing, but land actually is not just the surface. It contains the mineral rights, the air rights. There's a lot of other legal privileges that go along with owning land. And one of those rights that you have is that it can be subdivided. So we'll move on to the next one. How about economic characteristics? We're going to be talking about this after you respond to this question. So which of those do you think is an economic characteristic of land? We're at 50-50. I like to see that the majority of you chose answer C, which is correct. Location is key whenever you're buying land. If it's going to be in a city like Manhattan, being located there will increase the value. And also anywhere near the water, if you have land near the ocean, location is very important. So we'll move along to the next one. And here are the characteristics. You should recall these from your studies, and economic and physical are divided. Of course, land is scarce. There's only so much of it. They're not making any more. So that gives it its value. The improvements to the land, of course, you know, economically, that increases the value. The land is permanent. And the situs, the location, area preference, as we just said, is very important. Physical characteristics are that it's immobile, it's indestructible, and it's unique. And especially in various parts of the United States that have very different types of uses for land, and some parcels may be 50 acres and others may just be a quarter acre of various shapes and sizes, makes it very unique. We'll move to the next slide. Okay, let's get into some terminology. Whenever you make improvements to the land, it's something that's going to make it more usable and valuable. When people buy land, if it's a vacant lot, the first thing they usually do is construct a building and then maybe make some alterations to the land, put in a paved driveway and some landscaping to make it more enjoyable and usable. Fixtures are items that become part of the real estate. It's important to know and identify fixtures because they were once personal property that became attached and now are considered real property. The way that those fixtures can be attached is by annexation or severance. And so the fixtures that you do attach to the real estate permanently become part of that property and would stay with the property, even if the home is sold. Severance is when you have an item of real property and it changes to personal property because you have detached it. So as an example, annexation, you buy the type of air conditioner that goes into the wall and it's permanently attached. So that would become a fixture. Whereas if you had the type of air conditioner that goes in the window and can be easily removed, then that would not be a fixture. It can be removed and it would still be considered personal property. When you sever an item and you make it personal property by detaching it, an example would be a lighting fixture, maybe over the dining room table that is very expensive, perhaps a chandelier, and you want to take it with you when you sell the house, so you remove it. And so you have severed that fixture and it now becomes your own personal property and does not stay with the house. Okay, so just to review, personal property are any items that can be removed and belong to the individual owner. And then trade fixtures are changing the rules a little bit, because even though a fixture belongs to a tenant, if it's in a leased property for a business, if you decide to open a restaurant and it has a bar and maybe some stools that you want to permanently attach by bolting them down to the floor, those belong to the tenant. And even though they're attached to the property, that property is leased. And so they do not belong to the landlord. And when the business owner decides to close down or maybe move to a different space, they are allowed to take those fixtures with them because they're referred to as trade fixtures that are used in the business and belong to the tenant. Okay, so I guess we can go on to the next slide and take a little quiz about moving into your new house and you decide to plant some rose bushes, but you're leasing the house, you don't own it. And when you decide to move and the lease is up, which of those following statements is true? I'll give you some time to think about this one. Okay, the correct answer is D. The planting of the rose bushes was an annexation. As I mentioned, that is when a fixture becomes part of the real property. So since the rose bushes were planted, they cannot be removed. And I did want to mention chattel, which is just another term for a personal property. Okay, so here's another one. If you're going to be moving and you need to decide what stays with the property, which one of those choices do you think would not be addressed in the purchase contract, because that may change things? So it's least likely to stay with the property. Which one of those is considered your own personal property? I like this one. It looks like we have a winner, the barbecue grill. Yes, has everyone gotten that one? Okay, great. Yeah, the barbecue grill. Typically, if a seller is leaving, they will bring that with them. But the buyer could, in the purchase and sale agreement, make a deal with the seller, to have the barbecue stay and maybe pay an additional amount for it or work it into the purchase price somehow. So I'm glad everyone got that correct. Okay, let's talk about estates and land. We have freehold estates, and freehold estates refer to that bundle of rights that I talked about, where you have full ownership of the land. It includes all of those legal privileges. We have freehold estates that are divided up into fee and life estates. Fee estates are fee simple, which is the most common. That's also referred to as fee simple absolute. And then we have what's called a defeasible fee. And that is when the grantor transfers the land with conditions. And if that condition happens, then the transfer may be void. So going on to the other side with life estates, we have an ordinary life estate where you would retain the right to stay on the property until you die. So if a parent wanted to convey title to a son and make sure that even though the son now owned the land, that the parent could still stay on the property until they died, they would grant the land to the son by a deed and then retain a life estate for themselves. So they would be able to stay there, and that would be an ordinary life estate. The French para trivet type of life estate, that is a little different, and that's French for another's life. So that describes the duration of a property interest that you have possession for as long as someone else's, maybe a child. I've done this for clients where a family has a disabled child that requires care. And so they would hire someone as a companion, and then they allow that companion to stay on the property until that until the child dies. So that is commonly a use for that type of a life estate, where it's not for your own life, it's for the life of someone else. Okay, I think that should do it. We can move to the next one. So here's a question about ordinary life estates. Oh, that was quick. Go back. You got a little bit of a peek there, but which of those do you think is true? Describing an ordinary life estate. There you go. Excellent choice. The remainder man refers to the person who will be getting the estate eventually. So answer D is correct, that life tenants are responsible for protecting the interest, so that while the person is living on the property, they should maintain it, and so that when their term is up, it goes back to the original owner and it should be in good condition. Okay, everyone got that correct. Leasehold estates. Freehold is when you own it. A leasehold is when you lease it. So there's different types of leasehold estates. We have an estate for years, an estate at will, periodic estates, and estates at sufferance. An estate at will is usually that you don't have a formal lease or contract. You may have some type of an oral agreement. At will means that it could be terminated, so that if the landlord decided that they wanted you to move out, an estate at will would give them the right to do that. An estate for years is what you typically think of when you lease an apartment. Most leases are for the term of 1 year, and so when that year is up, you should vacate the premises. Some leases have a automatic renewal clause where if you don't let the landlord know within 30 or 60 days, that lease may automatically renew. And those are the types of leases that are referred to as estate for years. A periodic estate is usually a month to month, for a period of time. And so if you're not sure if you want to lease an apartment for the entire year, maybe you're going to college and you only want the apartment from September to May. So you may be able to rent it from month to month, and that makes it a periodic estate. The problem with doing that is if you did decide to stay maybe until the end of the year, you may not be able to do that if the landlord has another tenant. And usually you just need to give 30 days notice if that lease is to be terminated. And that would be by both sides, by both the landlord and the tenant could terminate with 1 month's notice. Okay, estate at sufferance is interesting. That's when a tenant stays in the apartment even after the lease expires. So the lease may have been up by the end of May, and in the summer they're still in the premises, they have not vacated. That's referred to as a holdover tenant, where they don't have the right to be there, but they just haven't moved out. And so let's go over to the next screen and have a question on this. How would you define a holdover tenant? Looks like we have a clear winner here. And B and C may be true if, they may not be paying rent and they're not legally entitled to possess, but the correct answer is that they have retained possession past the expiration of the lease. I'm glad to see that most of you got that one. Okay, getting into encumbrances. An encumbrance is anything that reduces the value of the property. It encumbers the land. And the typical type of encumbrance is a lien. There are various types of liens. The most common is the mortgage. Almost, all property at some point has a mortgage on it. And so the mortgage serves as a lien on the property that has to be paid. And until it is, that property cannot be sold. So if you are planning to sell your home, you would have to pay off the mortgage and have it released. And then you could close on that sale. A tax lien can be filed by both the IRS, by the state for income taxes, and also by the town or county for property taxes. If you have a tax lien on your land, that also encumbers it so that it cannot be refinanced or sold until that lien is paid in full. Once it is paid, they will release it to give the public notice that that lien no longer encumbers the property. A mechanics lien is filed by a contractor who may have done work on the property and then didn't get paid. So they are able to file a lien for the full amount of the contract that they performed. And then that would also hold up the property until it was paid. You cannot refinance or sell until those encumbrances are taken care of. Easements, on the other hand, will always stay with the property because they are for a specific purpose, such as utilities. It may be for the use of a driveway, or it could be for other types of uses. When you have an easement, you have the right to maintain that piece of land. And sometimes, say if it's for telephones or electrical wires, the utility company may come and trim trees and or even take down trees completely if they're interfering with the wires. So they have the right to do that. Even though it's your land, you've granted them an easement and they have the right to maintain it. A lease of a land, of course, encumbers it, because if you have a valid lease, then you may not be able to sell it until the lease is up, or you may have to work it out with the buyer that they're willing to take over that lease. There's other kinds of encroachments on property. It could be a fence, it could be a shed that you put up that maybe crosses over the border. Sometimes you'll plant a tree and it's small and then it grows so that it interferes with the neighbor's property. And so those encroachments are also types of encumbrances. And let's get into those types of liens a little bit more. We have general liens and specific liens. Both can be either voluntary or involuntary. And involuntary just means that you did not want to have this lien recorded against your land. That would be an example of a tax lien. You have delinquent taxes, and so they place a lien on your property. Voluntary type of lien would be when you grant a mortgage. So you borrowed money to buy the house, and so that's a voluntary lien that the lender put on the land in the form of a mortgage. I think that should do it for this slide. We'll talk about easements appurtenant. In this photo, you have a home by the water, and then you have another piece of land that borders the street. And as you can see, the back lot cannot access their property without having an easement over the other piece that borders Main Street. So they would be landlocked if they didn't have a right of way, which gives them the right to use that piece of land as a driveway. When you have an easement appurtenant, it's on adjacent parcels that border each other. You have a dominant tenement and a servient tenement. And so it would show that it benefits one piece and it burdens the other. So the landlocked piece has the benefit, and the lot on Main Street has the burden, because it actually reduces the value of your land to have a driveway easement, especially the way that this one is running almost right through the center of the piece of land. So you would not be able to interfere with that at all by planting anything such as a garden or doing any type of fencing or anything that would restrict the use of that easement. And then you need to remember that this runs with the land. When the easement is granted, it's recorded, and so that gives public notice. But then in later deeds, it may not be addressed. It may not be written into the deed that there is this easement. So as long as it was recorded the first time, you should have notice. and it runs with the land, which means that when the seller transfers title to a new buyer, they also take title subject to that easement. And we'll talk about another kind of easement now on the next slide, which is called easement in gross. And in easement in gross, there's no dominant parcel. You have a survey and estate, and it's typically for utilities. You'll notice the red arrow is pointing to the utility lines for the electric power. And so that is an easement that is granted when that land was first developed. And so that easement will run with the land. It's always there. Although it's not really a dominant parcel that's going to have a specific benefit from that. But there's other types of easements in gross. An example is a cell phone tower. If they contact you to install a cell phone tower, then they would pay you for the use of your land. But you're not really getting a benefit from that, except maybe better cell phone service. But it would be valuable. Typically, cell phone providers pay large amounts of money to build cell phone towers on someone's land. And another example might be a billboard. If someone wants to erect a billboard on your land, that would be an easement in gross. Okay, so again, just to review easements, they can be created by granting the easement to someone, and they can also be by necessity, by prescription, when someone is using the land, on a regular basis, maybe crossing through your lot to get to school, and it's been happening for years, and so eventually they may actually just get this easement that is by prescription, and sometimes by necessity, if maybe they're trying to access a lake, or there's some reason for them to have to cross through your land, and so that could create an easement. But that easement can also be terminated. It may just expire. If an easement is merged, it means that you have an easement over someone else's land, maybe in that previous photo, where then you later buy that piece of land, and now you own both pieces of property, so that easement would be merged. You could also release an easement. Maybe it's just no longer necessary, you don't really use it and you don't need it, so it could be released. If it's terminated by abandonment, it means that you have not used the easement. You kind of just gave up on it. Maybe you moved to a different state, and so once you abandon that easement, it would be terminated. Okay, this gives an example of encroachments where Lot A has their house and garage within their boundary lines, but Lot B maybe didn't know where the lot line was, and when their garage was built, it actually crosses over into the neighbor's property. So that garage would be encroaching on Lot A, and they may be required to actually take it down by demolishing it, or it could be worked out where the Lot B owner may pay the Lot A owner for that piece of land to be able to use their garage, and then that would actually change the description of the land. But encroachments can be for other reasons, maybe erecting a fence that is 5 feet over the neighbor's property. You may be forced to remove it, or any other type of land use, maybe a garden or putting up a shed. Those are all examples of encroachments. Okay, here we go. Which of the following is the most likely way a purchaser would discover an encroachment? If you wanted to make sure that there were no problems with encroachment on your property, what would you do? This is looking good. Okay. You're right that it would not be discovered by a title search or, creating a chain of title. A visual inspection of the property, some of you chose that answer. Maybe it might be obvious when you're looking at the land that there's a driveway, another driveway going across your property. But the way that you would discover the correct answer is survey. And I'm glad to see that most of you did get that one. Okay, ownership and severalty and co-ownership. If you have ownership and severalty, you own it individually. As a co-owner, there's different ways that you can take title to land, and that would be either by tenants in common, joint tenancy, tenancy by the entirety, and we also have a co-ownership of community property. Joint tenancy, as I mentioned earlier, is usually a married couple that will take title as joint tenants. And when they do, they have an equal interest in the land. If one of those tenants dies, then the remaining owner title passes at the moment of death. So if a husband and wife hold title as joint tenants, then one of the spouses dies, the surviving spouse would take title at the moment of death. Joint tenancy is sometimes referred to as joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. So that may help you to remember that if one spouse dies, the surviving spouse would take title. Tenants in common is different. It can be 2, 3, 4 or more owners. If you own property as tenants in common and one of you dies, the remaining interest would pass to your beneficiaries. So if you have, say, half interest in property with someone else, upon your death, if you hold title as tenants in common, your property passes according to your will. And if you don't have a will, then your property would pass according to the laws of intestacy, where it would go to your heirs. Tenancy by the entirety is only for married couples. It's in certain states. I think about 15 states have tenancy by the entirety. It's a concurrent estate. And if one of those spouses dies, then full title would pass to the surviving spouse. I'm sure that you've heard of community property. This is, again, only in certain states. And what it means is that if you have property prior to a marriage, then that would be considered your individual property. But any assets acquired during the marriage are considered community property, and upon divorce would be split 50-50. It's an automatic 50-50 split in any community property states. The only exception is that if one of the owners inherits during the term of the marriage, say the wife inherits from her father when he died, that would be considered as her property, would not have to be shared, but any other assets acquired would have to be split 50-50. Okay, so if a woman and her brother hold property as joint tenants, what happens if she deeds her interest to a husband? Okay, let's back it up once. Okay, good. So for those of you who are quick enough to see that, which I think is all of you, it would sever the joint tenancy, and that's correct. Joint tenancy does have to be at the same time title, interest, and possession. So that would sever it. Okay, so B was the correct answer. I'm glad all of you got that one. And how about a tenancy in common now? Which of those following statements is true? Okay, it looks like this question's a little tougher one, but the correct answer is A, that they have an equal right of possession, each owner. Okay, if we could go on to the next question. If you have a corporation that owns real property, how is that real estate owned by the corporation? Which of those is correct? Okay, I'm not sure why some of you think that there's insufficient information to answer. I'd be curious to find out what you were thinking. The correct answer is in severalty. And I'm sure you're aware that corporations are a separate legal entity. The officers, may own shares in the corporation, but they would not own any property that is owned by the corporation. So the correct answer is in severalty. Some of you did get that one, but maybe we can go over that a little bit in Q&A. Okay, getting into condos and co-ops. I'm sure that you're familiar with these two terms. There are differences between the two. They are individual units. In a condo, you get a deed that's, from the seller to the buyer, and it would contain a legal description of the land. You are taxed separately for your condominium unit, and it's usually created by a declaration of condominium that would give all of the locations of the units, any garages, and also the common areas that would be shared. Common areas would include a tennis court, a swimming pool, usually any type of a recreational facility that the condo may have. A co-op, on the other hand, is real estate that's owned by the corporation. So if you were to own a co-op, it would still be an individual unit that you would have. There are several co-ops in New York City. It's fairly common there, where you have a proprietary lease, no legal description. You have a maintenance fee that would include the taxes. And the unique thing about a co-op is that the individual owners would actually get to vote usually on any new members that are coming into the co-op. It's usually apartments that share a common hallway, and so they want to have some control over the unit owners. Okay. So moving on So the legal descriptions. You'll see on the map that meets and bounds is found on the East Coast and in Texas. The rectangular government survey system that consists of principal meridians and baselines is in the central, Midwest and West states. And then we have another type of legal description that is referred to as a recorded plat. And that's when a map is recorded in the land records that refers to the property. The meets and bounds, since it's based on compass directions, it's usually for very unique pieces of land that have unusual shapes. And it's described by this meets and bounds that would have to be plotted out so that you can actually see what it looks like in the form of a map. The rectangular government survey, I'm sure you're all aware, that is creating sort of a checkerboard with township lines, and each piece of land is usually in the shape of a square or sometimes a rectangular shaped lot. But the rectangular survey system is based on the principal meridians and then along the baselines with the range lines, and then that's divided up with the township lines and tiers. Okay, and here's sections within this township on this rectangular survey. So you'll see that each one of those blocks would be a square mile, and then you may buy various blocks, maybe a group of blocks in the corner or just one individual square mile of land, depending on the way that the property is being sold. Okay, so you have parcels within each of these sections, and you'll notice that the blue section in the top right corner would equal 160 acres, and that's being referred to as the northeast quarter. And then you have the yellow section next to it that is divided up even more into 4 square parcels that each has their own description for that piece. And then below in the blue, those pieces are divided differently, where it's twice as much on the north and south halves, and then the west and east are in a different direction, still the same area of land in that rectangular shape. Okay. So for the question, for the acres in the southwest quarter of the northeast quarter of section 8, how many acres do you think are in that section? Looks like most of you have responded. Maybe give it a little bit more time. All right. More than half of you went for B, but the correct answer was C, being 40 acres. So if you divide the 640 acre parcel by 16, it works out to 40 acres. So we'll try another one as far as how that piece of land is described on the next question. So if you're going to have a legal description for that specific area on the bottom left, how do you think you would describe that particular piece in blue. Okay, the correct answer is C. The northwest quarter of the southwest quarter of Section 8. Majority of you got that one. All right. So let's move over to what you think would be the best legal description, which type for an irregularly shaped parcel of land. You were quick on the draw with this one. Yes, I'm glad you remember. Meets and bounds would be the way to describe those types of land. I think that's our third question that everyone got right. So I'm glad to see that you remembered. And let's move along now to what to expect. You have some experimental questions that are going to be on the exam, maybe 5 or 10. Those are ungraded, and the timer will stop when you're taking them. You may not know which of those questions are experimental, so that they won't be counting. And then as far as what to expect again, check your guide, for the total number of questions, your passing score. And then if you want to go back to questions and change a response, you're able to do that, assuming you have enough time left on the clock. Okay, I think we have some time for Q&A, if anyone wants to chat.
All right, thank you, Lucy. It looks like we were able to answer most of your questions already, but if you have any others,
good.
feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And let's see, here's one. Will you please give examples of the difference between voluntary and involuntary specific liens?
Okay, if you have a voluntary lien, then obviously it's something that you want and that you're willing to voluntarily agree to have that lien recorded. And obviously involuntary is when it's usually as a result of a court judgment or some type of a regulation maybe, where it's a lien that is not something that you agree to, but it's recorded involuntarily anyway. Does that answer your question?
I believe so, yes. And we have another one. Will there be a recording of this? Yes, absolutely. We'll be sending a recording to you either later today or tomorrow. And let's see, another question. Can you explain the difference in the types of defeasible estates, determinable versus on condition?
Sorry, determinable, what was the rest of that?
Versus on condition.
I think when we were talking about defeasible estates, maybe that's what you're referring to. If you have a condition where you are to remain, on the property until you get married. Once you do get married, then that would be an example of you, satisfying that condition. And so then the title may transfer back. When we were talking about defeasible estates, I think, does that answer you? As an example?
Yeah, Mary, let us know if that answers your question. And let's see, back to specific liens. Can you provide an example of a specific lien as distinct from a general lien?
Okay, if you have a specific lien, it's attaching to one of your properties. If you have a general lien, it's attaching to a number of properties. So if I got a judgment for one of my clients and the debtor wasn't able to pay it, I would record that lien on any assets that they own. If they have a primary home, I'm going to put the lien on that piece of property. And I'm also going to put a lien on maybe a vacation home that they have at the beach. So that would be referred to as a general lien because I'm just trying to collect from any assets that they may have. Where if it's a specific lien, it could be a mechanics lien where work was performed on this particular home and then the contractor didn't get paid. So that lien would only apply to that specific house. And maybe that's a good way to remember it. A specific lien attaches to a specific piece of property that would only be that one piece of property.
Okay, and it looks like we have one more question. Going back to corporations owning in severalty, can you please explain?
Okay, when you form a corporation, it's referred to as a separate legal entity. Corporations are called artificial persons because they can do pretty much, you know, what regular people can do, human beings. The thing is that if a corporation owns land, that land is only in the name of the corporation. A corporation is owned by shareholders. So, you know, say Lucy's Lattes, I buy a piece of land and I build a coffee shop, and that corporation, the Lucy's Lattes Inc., would own that piece of land in the individual corporate name, which means in severalty as an individual title holder. Just because someone's an officer or a director, that doesn't give them any ownership right over anything, any property that the corporation holds title to. So the title will only be in the corporate name.
Okay, yep, they confirmed that makes sense. Thank you for clarifying.
Okay.
Here's one more. Why were the rose bushes annexed to the property when it was described as a tenant, not an owner or sale, similar to the bar stools bolted to the
That's
floor?
a great question. I like this one. To annex just means to attach. So if I own a house and I let you rent it and you decide to go ahead and plant some rose bushes, that's great, but it's actually my land. And once you plant those bushes, they're annexed, which means that, you know, they're attached. So they went from being your personal property to my real property, okay? And I think a couple of those options on that question were, well, what if I replace them? Well, you know, that you don't really have the right to do that. Once that personal property that you bought at the garden center and then planted became part of the real property because it was permanently attached and would have to stay with the land.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here today. We appreciate it. And I'd like to thank Lucy for joining us today. Your
Thank you.
knowledge, expertise, and willingness to share with our student community is greatly appreciated. Yes, thank you. Look for an email from us with this presentation and keep an eye out for additional invites to webinars in the future. And once this webinar ends, you'll have the option to fill out a survey. If you're able to take a minute, we'd love your feedback so we can continue to provide valuable webinars. Thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.